Good morning. Welcome to this WIOA webinar. My name is Kirsten Sheary with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I will be the facilitator for today's webinar. Today's topic is Evaluation under WIOA, an introduction. As a reminder, all participants on the call are in mute mode. Please use the raise your hand function in the webinar if you would like to speak to the presenter. But for this specific webinar, we're going to ask that if you have questions to type it in the comment or chat box. It could be labeled one or the other. So please type your questions throughout, and we will answer those throughout as well. So that way we can address them as we're talking about that topic. A reminder that this webinar will be recorded, and any documents from today's webinar along with the recorded webinar can be downloaded via our website at icsps.illinoisstate.edu and also on the Illinois WorkNet website within 48 hours after today. You will also receive a survey asking you about today's webinar, and please share with us your experience and any suggestions you might have to help us improve these webinars. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter for today, Cynthia Borland.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everybody. I see we have quite a few folks signed in, over 200. I'm going to be realistic. I think some of those are probably people interested in evaluation, and others of you probably just want a distraction from the weird quarantine we're all under. So, I'm going to be humble about that. So, but thank you all for being here. This is one of 3 webinars I'm going to be providing on evaluation. So this is where we're doing our introduction. And as was just stated, please don't hesitate at any point in the conversation. If you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand electronically, because I want to be able to answer things in the moment. You don't need to hold your questions to the end. We will have time for questions at the end, but please don't wait if there's something you're wondering, because other people are going to have the question too, right? And it's an opportunity to make sure everyone is following along and getting what we're talking about. So with that, here I am, Cynthia Borland. I have a little bit of background on me. I have a few decades in public service, mainly at state level, both legislative branch and executive branch. I most recently worked for the Washington State Workforce Agency, Employment Security Department, and was in charge of labor market information, performance analysis, evaluation, research. So have a little bit of experience in what we're talking about today and starting to think about evaluation. So what are we going to do today? Here are our objectives. Welcome and introduction. We've already gotten a little bit of start on that, but I want to hear more about you guys in just a minute. We're going to talk through what the WIOA evaluation requirement is, and frankly, what it isn't. We're going to talk about evaluation options and funding. So given that requirement, what are some of your options for conducting evaluations? What does that mean? And ways to pay for that. And then we're going to do wrap up and next steps. So before we dig a little deeper in, one thing I want to say is this is a focus around the evaluation requirement under WIOA. But I do want to take a moment to step back a little bit and just talk about the concept of evaluation. So let's say there were no evaluation requirement under the, I guess, still new law. It's 5 years old now, not so new. Even if there weren't that new evaluation requirement with WIOA, we know that evaluation is valuable. How do we know it? When members of legislatures, Congress, other leaders, they have questions about how are we spending our money? Taxpayers have questions about how are we spending public dollars? Are we getting value? Are we getting bang for our buck? Are we making a difference? And aside from the money, you and all of your colleagues, you're in this work because you want to help your customers get a job, get a better job, get better wages, have a sustainable career, support their families, right? So we all want to be doing work that is meeting the goals that we're setting out to achieve. And really the best way to determine that is to be able to do some sort of evaluation to see whether or not what we're doing is working. So I want to frame that up. Like I said, before we talk about the specifics in WIOA, this is just an important topic and important to how we do our work. Now, I want to hear a little bit about you guys. So where's your local area? If you want to put that into the chat, let us know where you are. I'm a big fan of Chicago as well as Springfield because I have one of my best friends from graduate school lives in Springfield. So I have a lot of love for your state. So let us know where you're joining us from right now.
Okay, we have people from Evanston, Illinois, Chicago Heights, Champaign, Chicago, local area 7, Kankakee, Rockford, Peoria, Illinois, lots from Chicago,
Sure.
North Riverside, Lake County, Waterloo, Roseland, Galesburg, Decatur, Springfield, Danville,
Okay, good. I was waiting to hear Springfield.
yeah, Wyoming, Eureka, Rock Island, Hammond, Indiana, which is awesome. So yeah, kind of all over. St. Clair,
Awesome.
Litchfield.
That's great. Yeah, and I like we got some on a neighboring state because yeah, that was always an interesting thing when you're working at the local state level. You know, people do manage to drive across state lines to go to work or look for a job or to live. So these state boundaries aren't always all that important, right, when you're serving your customers. So the next thing I want to know a little bit more about you is what program are you with? So there are a bunch of these little dots here on this slide, list a couple of different options to say the least. But go ahead and type into the chat what program you're with, and however you call it is fine, whether it's the way it's abbreviated on this slide or not. But, you know, are you in Title I? If you're in Title I, are you an adult, youth, or dislocated worker? Are you Wagner-Pizer? Are you Trade Act? And for many of you, you might be a lot of the dots on this slide, depending upon how large your area is that you're in. So please go ahead and let us know what program you're representing.
Looks like we have adult workforce, Title I, WIOA, adult WIOA, ROE, adult education, adult and dislocated worker, adult youth, a Boys and Girls Club Chicago, OSY, WIOA out of school youth, Alternative Schools Network, IDS Wagner Pizer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that
Yep,
correctly.
you are. Yeah, Wagner-Pizer.
Dislocated in adults, grants manager, youth, adult ed. It does look like, Cynthia, that a lot of people are commenting that they can only see your first slide. So I'm not sure if you have been advancing yet or not.
Oh, I have been, and I can see him advancing on my screen. Okay. Oh, hold on.
Good thing we caught that now. There we go.
Yeah. Okay, somehow I got paused on show my screen. My apologies, folks.
Okay.
So just so you know, the last slide was a fantastic map of your great state. So that's when I was asking you about local area. That's what I was looking at. My apologies that you weren't looking at it with me. And then, yeah. Okay, so it sounds like we have a really good mix of programs too. I at least heard titles 1, 2, and 3. Not sure I heard anyone from Voc Rehab.
Yeah, we have a ton of people from CTE, from ICCB,
That's great. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you for sharing that. So with that, I think we're going to dig into a poll, because I want to understand not just what program you're from and what part of the state you're from, but want to know how familiar are you with the WIOA evaluation requirement. And this is going to be a poll that will pop up that you can directly interact with, because I want each of you to vote. And the basic questions are, wait, what requirement? Which in parentheses is like, what on earth are you talking about? The second one is, I remember hearing something about it, but I was too busy getting WIOA performance figured out. Third one, I have a basic idea of the requirement. And then if you're getting really advanced, I understand the requirement, but I'm still trying to determine our next steps in meeting it. And then the real overachievers, I understand it and I know we're already meeting it. So we're gonna pop up that poll, and please vote on where the option that represents where you're at right now.
Okay, we still have some coming in.
Sure, yeah, let's give a moment or two.
Okay, they've kind of settled down here.
Okay.
So it looks like we have about 25% saying wait, what requirement?
Great. That's honesty. I love it.
Yeah, 16% saying I remember it, but I was getting too busy trying to figure out WIOA performance. 37% have a basic idea of the requirement.
Okay. All right.
15% are still trying to, they understand it, but they're still trying to determine next steps. And then about 7% are the last option. They know they're, and they understand it as well.
Awesome.
I'm going to go ahead and close that.
Okay.
So I can share the
You guys
results.
all see my screen again? Okay, let me know if you can see my slides again. So I'm still on the poll. So first of all, thank you for your honesty, because I would have been really surprised if we didn't have quite a few of you saying, wait, what requirement? So this is totally fair. For someone like myself who spent a lot of time with WIOA law, with WIOA regulations, these are things that you start to be able to recite in your sleep. But when you're in the midst of implementing a program on the ground, whether you're on the policy side, the operations side, delivering services, or the performance data side, there's a lot to process. So I am not at all surprised that we have a quarter of you saying, what on earth is this all about? And, you know, I remember hearing something about it, but it got lost in the fog of WIOA performance. For those of you who are heavy into performance, or those of you who have an awareness of it and know how it impacts, you know that that changed from WIA to WIOA. There were a number of changes to the measures and new measures, so that's been a lot to tackle over the last 4 years, because performance went in 2016. And then basic idea of the requirement, 37%, that warms the cockles of my heart. That's fantastic. And then even more, 15%, understand it, trying to determine next steps, and 7% say, yep, we're on it, we're rocking it. So that's a great mix. And once again, thank you for your honesty. So let's dig into the content of what we're talking about. So as part of the same section of the law that goes through the new performance measures, there's this thing called an evaluation requirement. And we're going to spend a good bit of time talking through the specifics of what this is and what this looks like, but I'm going to do my best not to make it sound too incredibly boring. And this is the point at which I especially want you to put questions in the chat for us to respond to. If, as I'm going along, things aren't making sense, they're confusing, please let us know. So what's the requirement? The first element of it is that the state, in coordination with local boards and state agencies responsible for administration of core programs, must conduct ongoing evaluations of Title I core program activities. And as you may or may not know, Title I core programs, that's adult dislocated worker youth. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, if I'm not Title I, I get to check out. Ha, no such luck. So as we'll talk more about, this is envisioning evaluations across all titles, but it's very explicit to say, at a very minimum, states must be conducting evaluations of Title I core programs. So let's go back to the beginning of that first bullet. The state, in coordination with local boards and state agencies responsible for administration of core programs. So that's all of you, right? That's everybody. Whether you're at the local level, whether you're in a state VR agency, a state adult agency, we're all part of this mix and being able to conduct these ongoing evaluations. So that's the basic idea. Let's dig a little deeper because the law keeps going. You know, Congress likes to use a lot of words, right? So the state, local boards, and state agencies, good, all right, we got those on the previous slide, must conduct evaluations. Why? In order to promote, establish, implement, and utilize methods for continuously improving core program activities in order to achieve high-level performance within and high-level outcomes from the workforce development system. So, as you know, we have these performance measures, right? We look at wages, we look at employment 2 months, 2 quarters, 2 months, 2 quarters out, 4 quarters out. We look at credential attainment, measurable skill gains, engagement with employers. So all of these things we're looking at, but the idea here is even beyond that quarterly analysis of how states and locals are doing against your targets, we need to make sure we're continuously improving our activities in order ultimately to achieve higher level performance. So that's a start of how these two play into each other and how this evaluation requirement is something separate from what we're talking about with the basic performance measures. So what do these evaluations have to involve? They must be designed in conjunction with the state board. You're getting a trend here, right? The state board, state agencies responsible for core programs and local boards, and must include, and I'll get back to the brackets in just a second, must include analysis of customer feedback and outcome and process measures in the statewide workforce development system. So the law includes a couple specifics here. You know, we want to know what customers are saying, and that's customer feedback. That's not a new element in WIOA. We had that in WIA. And outcome and process measures. So the bracketed piece there is one that was added in the regulations to say when appropriate. And I think this was a wise move on the agency's part to say, you know, depending upon what you're studying, customer feedback may not always be relevant. So it's not as though every evaluation is going to include that. But Congress very much wanted to highlight, you know, this is about hearing from your customers as well. So that's why this piece is important. And I think the caveat that was provided in the regulations is important as well. And I'm going to take just a moment to breathe here because I want to make sure we have a chance to see if any questions have come in. And if there's anything you're wondering about, please type a question into the chat. All right, then I'll just keep forging ahead, guys. Let's see. We got more. Evaluations must use designs that employ the most rigorous analytical and statistical methods that are reasonably feasible, such as the use of control groups. So this is a pretty short sentence, but there's a lot going on. So let's break this down. So,
Cynthia,
yes.
we did have a couple questions if you want to address them.
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. How often do the evaluations take place?
So that's a great question. There is an expectation, and we'll get to this, that you talk in your annual report at the end of the year about what evaluations you're doing and what you're planning. And so you're gonna want to be engaging in some form of evaluation kind of all the time. you're going to need to pick what you want to evaluate, what those research questions are, and what that specifically looks like. And in further slides, we're going to talk more about some of those specifics, but basically it's not just like, oh, it's not the sort of thing kind of like with monitoring where, okay, once every year you have to evaluate each program. It's more open than that, but it's also not saying you only have to evaluate one program every 4 years. So it's really about continuing, and let me actually go back a slide or two. Yes. So the very first statement in the evaluation requirement is conduct ongoing evaluations. So really this is about a way of life. But where it gets interesting is the ability to pick what you want to look at when and what your research questions are.
Okay, that was the only one that I've seen come in so far.
Okay, great, thank you. So this concept of rigorous analytical statistical methods. Basically what this statement is saying is, if you're going to do an evaluation, which you're required to do the very best possible evaluation you can. Something that's going to give you the most reliable, meaningful results. And I'm just going to give an example. I'm going to kind of jump to something else that might have some meaning in our just day-to-day lives. So let's think a little bit about polling. So politicians do a lot of polling, other firms do polling, right? And sometimes you'll see there for people who are being really transparent, they'll give you a margin of error based upon how big the sample was. And sometimes it's plus or minus 2-4 percentage points. Sometimes it's even higher than that. And so the basic idea here is, if you're going to do evaluation, you want to have a lot of confidence in your results. If you have something that comes out and says, wow, that new intervention you did with out of school youth, that made a huge difference. You want to be 100% or as close as possible to knowing that that really did work. Or on the flip side, if you're looking at something and you're saying, oh, that level of engagement we did with folks particularly with vision disabilities, didn't seem to make a difference. So we want to stop doing that and find something that will make a difference. You're going to be making important decisions based upon this, and that's really why you want to be using the most rigorous method you can. Now, the other piece in here I want to emphasize is reasonably feasible. So we're operating in a real world with human beings, and we have limited resources. So this is recognizing as well, yeah, the ideal is that you'd have 99% confidence in your results, but in this real world, that's not always going to be possible. So we're going to talk more about what some of the range of options look like, but I think that gives you an idea of kind of what the intent is here. So you can't just do evaluations and keep the results hidden away somewhere. Not that you would want to, but this makes, I think, the evaluation requirement even more clear and more meaningful in terms of what was originally intended. So the state must annually prepare, submit to the state board, local boards, and make available to the public, including by electronic means, which for all of you, I think is probably standard procedure at this point, reports containing the results of evaluations conducted to promote the efficiency and effectiveness of the workforce development system. So this emphasizes that we don't just want to evaluate these programs so that somebody can get a PhD, but we want to evaluate these programs so we can share the information and ultimately make improvements in the system. There's a purpose here. So you don't want to think about having, well, I'm going to have this evaluation shop over here in the corner and we're going to have them work on things and that's going to be great. And we can check the box with Department of Labor, Department of Education. No one will get mad at us, but we're not really going to do anything with them. So in fact, the third webinar of this series, we're going to talk a lot about reporting out on results and how to do that and what that looks like. So we'll go into that more then. But for the time being, just want to emphasize that the law is very clear that a big piece of this is sharing those results and that information, not just with state board, local board, but also with the wider public. And part of what we're going to talk about that third webinar is how on earth do you do that in a meaningful way that people can understand and not just have their eyes glaze over? So that's my teaser for webinar number 3.
Cynthia, we did have another question come through.
Yes, please.
Is a form of evaluation TABE or CASAS testing?
So I believe that is, I don't know if I'm not sure on those acronyms, but I believe that's a type of assessment of individual customers. Is that correct?
I'm not 100% sure. They didn't elaborate, but
No,
the
I was
question.
just waiting to see if they would chat back and
Oh,
respond.
yeah.
So if I'm
Yeah.
correct on that, that would
Okay.
be a potential piece of data that you
Yeah,
would look at. So
correct.
that wouldn't necessarily be an evaluation. That would be a sign. You might say, I want to evaluate whether or not this new practice makes an impact on those scores. And so that would be something you would test. And so those scores would be a very important piece of data that you would use in that analysis. But if I'm totally misunderstanding what you're referring to, please put into the chat so I can clarify.
No, they said that that is correct. It is reading, assessment of math and reading levels.
Yep. Okay, so that's a skill assessment of some sort, right? So that's any type of skill assessment that will tell you, well, let me rewind. So when you're starting up a new program or a new approach or a new way of interacting with your customers, it can be small, it can be big. You're ultimately probably trying to move the needle, as they say, on something like those test scores. So knowing that test score data is going to be a key input into your evaluation. The key with the evaluation is going to be what methods do we need to figure out whether or not we really made a difference in what those numbers look like. And we will talk about that a little bit more later this morning, as well as in the second session. But keep those questions coming. I love it. So let's now talk a little bit more about our federal partners. The state must coordinate their evaluations with the evaluations provided for by the Secretaries of Labor and Education under WIOA. And again, we have a little caveat that was added in regulation to the extent feasible. So the language here might seem a little weird. Evaluations provided for by secretaries. So they don't just say conducted by, because oftentimes the feds will fund a third party to do an evaluation. So basically, anytime labor or education is funding a study, they're wanting you to coordinate your evaluations with them. The state must also, to the extent practicable, cooperate in the conduct of evaluations provided for by labor and education. So you guys, some of you might remember the gold standard study. That was something that was done, and I'm not sure if Illinois had one in a site in your state or not, but that was one where Department of Labor was doing the study, but states were obviously expected to participate in that, cooperate. So there are a couple of specific items here of what does that cooperation look like: providing data, responses to surveys, allowing for timely site visits, and then once again here in brackets, added in regulation, data and survey responses from and timely site visits with local subgrantees and state and local boards. So basically what this is saying is, you know, we want you to do evaluations. We also really need you to coordinate with and help us out with evaluations that are happening at the federal level. None of this, I'm sure, is a news flash, because most of the money and the rules come from the federal level. So we know we need to cooperate and coordinate with them. The upside of this, other than just being, please work with labor and education, that I do want to point out is this is also an opportunity as you're starting to figure out what evaluation looks like. This can be a matter of using as a guide what labor and education are doing. You don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper. So you can kind of piggyback on or look at what they're doing, see how that might be appropriate for one of your local levels and how you might want to do a similar sort of study. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's the piece in the annual report. So specifically for Titles 1 and 3, states need to submit an annual statewide performance report narrative. Yes, you know. But important for Titles 1 and 3, Narrative must include specific items, including, now there was a lot of stuff in the law. I just pulled out the stuff that's really relevant to what we're talking about today. Current or planned evaluation and related research projects, including methodologies used. Efforts to coordinate development of such projects with WIOA core programs, other state agencies and local boards. List of completed evaluation and related reports and links to where they were made accessible to the public electronically. State efforts to provide data, survey responses, and timely site visits for federal evaluations, and any continuous improvement strategies utilizing results from studies and evidence-based practices evaluated. So here what we're saying is, in that annual report you get to do every year, make sure you talk about how you're meeting the requirements that we just walked through. What projects are you doing? How are you coordinating with federal research projects? How are you sharing results with the public when they want to see where those are? So that's basically what that's about. So it's one more thing you need to make sure you're keeping in mind. And, you know, there are realistic expectations at the federal level. So it can be a matter of saying, and for the state of Illinois, you can say this, and this is how I've met some of you guys, is there was an evaluation peer learning cohort. And Illinois has a team, as that's wrapping up, who are a part of that. So that's something you could talk about in your narrative. You could say, we're working on a state action plan. We sent a team who was a part of this process. That lets the federal level know we're taking this seriously. We're looking at evaluation. So they're not going to have an expectation that you snap your fingers and you go from not necessarily having evaluation capacity to all of a sudden putting out 5 evaluation studies a year. But this is the opportunity for you to be able to tell that story in your annual report. So we walked through the requirements for evaluation, and now we're going to start to talk a little bit more about options. So what that looks like is, what is it that you may do within that? And this first one is pulled from the regulations, and then we're going to get to some other technical assistance products that have been published. But this first one starts to say a little more about, what is this really going to look like? What does this mean? What do we expect? So you may conduct evaluations jointly examining Title I core program activities and activities under other core programs in Titles 2 through 4. So remember at the beginning I said, if you're not Title I, please don't check out. This is still relevant for you. And this is not going to be surprising to anyone who spent some time with WIOA. There's a real interest in the way the law was written, and the way the regs have been written, to say we want to make sure we're coordinating across all 4 titles. Individual human beings can be served by multiple titles. They could be co-enrolled all at the same time. So we need to be working together on that. So that's what that's about. So similar to those authorized for or conducted by labor and education, here are some types of studies you can do. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. You can do process and outcome studies. You can do pilot and demonstration projects, analysis of administrative and program data, impact and benefit cost analysis, and use of rigorous designs to test efficacy of various interventions. That's a long list. You might not know what all those things are. We're going to talk more about them. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that you are not limited to a randomized control trial, meaning I need to put someone in a lottery and the services they get are determined what comes out of that lottery, and they don't get to make any choices and they don't have any options. That's not the only kind of study you can do. There are a lot of kinds of things that would fall under this evaluation requirement. As I said, we're going to talk more about that in the next coming slides. The other option they want to point out, over multiple program years, involving multiple phases and such tasks and activities as necessary for an evaluation. So basically what we're saying here is there's a lot involved. This isn't a quick, I'm going to take 6 months, I'm going to do evaluation, I'm going to be done, I'm going to move on with my life. So I said it was kind of this ongoing, continuous process. So what do you start off with oftentimes? Literature evidence review. You might be a feasibility study. You're going to be planning it, designing it. figuring out what that looks like. This is not a quick and simple process. And ultimately, it's not a quick and simple process because you want to ensure you get those meaningful results that we talked about if you're going to be taking action on the results of these studies, of these evaluations. We're going to talk more in webinar number 2 about the steps involved here in this last bullet. What does it look like to do your literature review? How do you identify your research questions? So we're going to be spending more time on that in that next session. This starts to give you an idea as to what this requirement could mean and what some of your options are. So there are 4 basic different kinds of studies that Department of Labor calls out and says, these are all legitimate evaluations. This is the sort of thing we mean. This is the sort of thing that you can do. And here we're transitioning from referring to the law and regulations to this great toolkit that Department of Labor has put together as technical assistance. And we've got a link for that in the resources slides at the end here. But this is where we talk a little bit more about what kind of research you could do. Implementation studies, this is the first one. So just on its face, you think that probably has to do with somehow looking at how you've implemented something, right? Yes, it's pretty straightforward. So you're looking to document program operations or compare them against goals across locations or over time. Describe and analyze what happened and why in the design, implementation, administration, and operation of programs. Determine if a program is being carried out in a manner consistent with its goals. It may include case studies, fidelity studies, performance studies, and site comparison studies. So basically what implementation studies are about is, did what we do what we set out to do? This is particularly important, let's say, if you're taking a model that's been well researched and put out in other states. Let's say there's a program relating specifically to dislocated workers who used to work in a certain kind of wood processing plant, right? So if that's something that was a proven model and you want to implement it in one of your local areas in Illinois, you might be interested in doing an implementation study because you want to make sure that you're using fidelity to model, sometimes they'll call it, but basically implementing exactly what you set out to implement. So that's the first type. The second type are outcome studies. So this is where we're not just saying, did we implement the program we wanted to implement? This starts to look at, okay, what's the outcome of what we did? So this is a matter of comparing individual outcomes against goals across programs or locations or over time. So outcomes against goals, that starts to sound like performance measures and target setting, right? Okay, so that might be something where you look at how you're doing on performance measures, like I said, across programs, over time, that sort of thing. Determining whether programs achieve the desired results or assess the effectiveness of programs to produce some sort of change. So did we in fact see wages move, or did wages stay stagnant over time? This might include longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So this is something where oftentimes you are going to be looking over time. These are things that even if this is not the most rigorous study, it can take a good bit of calendar time simply because you need results to occur, right? So you need to wait for someone to get employment or see how their wages grow, and that fact has to occur in the real world before you can do any sort of analysis of it. It's very easy sometimes for researchers to want to kind of hit fast forward on that so you can get 10 great years of data, but you know, so far we haven't figured out how to impact time that way. So let me pause here now that we've talked about 2 of the 4 types of studies, and let me just pause and see if there are questions.
There are not any questions, but there are a couple comments. Would you like me to address
please,
them?
yes.
Okay. Regarding the annual report, the state board coordinates input from all partners in addition to the required titles 1 and 3. Thus, they would be looking for evaluations from those other partners. So that was just a comment.
Yes. So that's right. So that's generally when we're talking about In this case, with the direction on the annual report, it's guidance that comes out. So that's in this case a training and employment guidance letter, TEAGL. And so that's going to give you the bare minimum, right? That's going to say at a minimum, these two titles have to do this. But that makes complete sense that the expectation in your state would be that be coming across all 4 titles. That makes total sense.
And then also we have Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership suggested all career coaches attend this. I believe CCWP thought maybe this would cover how to evaluate clients. I think that's why you were asked about the TABE and CASA's evaluation.
Okay.
If you notice
Okay.
viewers dropping off, it's because we wanted clarification on those, I guess.
Okay, great. Yes, so my apologies for any confusion. So this is not about evaluating individual clients. So this is not about case managing, evaluating individual clients. How individual clients are doing are a critical input, but this is looking at evaluating across systems, across the state, across programs. So it's really about saying, how does this new program, perhaps in a local area we've implemented with our youth, how effective is that program? It's not going to be looking so much at individual performance of individuals you might be case managing. So I hope that clarifies, and I hope I'm not wasting anybody's time.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. That's all we have for now.
Okay. So the third kind of study is impact studies. Actually, let me go back and say one more thing. So if you are working with individual clients and you want to make sure you're helping them, even if you're not going to be directly involved in evaluation is going to help you do that better. Because evaluation is going to be able to test out the kinds of things that you are doing on the ground and help you figure out how you can be as effective as possible. So that would be, to me, an important tie-in. So the third kind we're going to talk about are impact studies. Now, this is the kind of thing you probably have in the back of your head when you think about what an evaluation is. This is more the kind of heavy duty, really intense sort of processes that give you those most reliable, meaningful results. So they tend to require more resources and involvement, more technological expertise, folks who know statistics and other methods. But the upside is you get really good, reliable results out of it. So largely it's meant to estimate the difference in individual outcomes attributable to a specific program or policy. So it's not very easy. It's pretty straightforward to say, we want to know before this program how people were doing on a particular measure. Let's say, were they employed or not? And then we want to look at the end of the program and see, did those numbers go up at all? That gives you a sense that you're moving in the right direction. But there are all these things going on in people's lives. So why did someone decide to come to this particular program? Why did they choose this? What are their other circumstances that are going on? What maybe is some information about their previous employment history? Those can all have an effect on how someone does that might not have a lot to do with the great services you're providing. So impact studies attempt to peel all that away. So you really want to figure out, are the programs and policies we're implementing actually causing the differences of the outcomes that they're designed to influence? Or in a way, is it kind of a coincidence that we ended up with folks in this new program who were seriously motivated, seriously driven, and frankly might have had those improved outcomes even separate from the program because of the sorts of things that were driving them? So this is where you think about doing experimental, or what they call quasi-experimental studies. So a full experimental study is randomized control trial. Now, the thing we're probably most familiar with is studies of new drugs that are coming out, right? We all know the idea of a placebo, and if you go into a study, you don't necessarily know, did you get the placebo or the real drug? And that's one of the best ways to figure out whether or not that drug has an actual impact. So in public policy in the real worlds of human beings, that can be controversial in terms of limiting someone's options. The flip side of that is it can also be a way to fairly, by a random process, use really constrained resources. So if you're introducing a new program, let's say particular a training program that's maybe has a pretty high cost to it, you know you're only going to be able to serve 50 people in that program. So one way to be able to do an experimental study is to say, we know we have way more people who are interested. If we do this in a truly random way, selecting who goes into it, this would allow us to do an experimental study. So it isn't just a matter of saying we want to toy with your lives and not let you make choices. It can also be, this is a really fair way to try to spread out really scarce resources. Now, quasi-experimental studies are a little bit different. They attempt to do the same thing that an experimental study does, but they kind of manufacture a control group. And how you can do that is to say, let's say, for instance, you want to look at a study of someone who goes into a particular training program, they're dislocated workers. And you have this group of people who all go into this particular, let's say, a CDL, truck driving program. If you can go back and look in your data and find people who are really good matches to the people who participated in that program. The only really difference is they chose not or didn't choose to or didn't know about that program, but their employment history is similar, their wage history is similar, their demographic characteristics are similar, they're from a similar geography, part of the state, whether that be more rural area or more urban area. So you can do that and you can match folks up that way without doing random assignment. So as I said, these kinds of studies are the most rigorous, the most intensive. They give you the best results, but they are more resource intensive in requiring time and also the skills of people to be able to design and implement these. Now, the fourth and last kind I want to talk about are cost studies. So this is where you would be estimating program cost, making cost comparisons, weighing cost against outcomes or impacts. They involve the analysis of cost of a program. You might weigh program effectiveness overall against program cost. These are the sorts of things where you might say, we got 10 employments in this one quarter out of this one program. How much did we spend on this program for that time period? Now, if we divide that by 10, how much should we end up spending to get each of those employments? So this is different than an impact study. It can be a part of an impact study, but it's not necessarily going to give you causality, but it's one of those things that you're going to get pretty common questions about, which is kind of that initial idea of bang for your buck. Because you find, if you're finding you're putting a ton of money into something, and you're getting 1 or 2 employment outcomes, that might not be such a great sign. And even without doing a far more robust and resource intensive analysis, you can get an indication that there might be a problem here. And you might want to go in a different direction, dig deeper, do some more analysis. So these studies, even there are 4 separate kinds, they all play into each other. And so if you're working on a new program, let's say back we talked about an implementation study, right? And you want to make sure that what you're implementing is what you were planning to implement. Let's say you do that and you find out, oh, yeah, that was, we did implement exactly what we were planning to implement. And the next level is to say, and now let's do a cost study. Let's see how much that cost. We wanted to provide these new series of options. We've offered them in the way we plan to. How much are we spending on those? So you might even do a cost per participant. And if you look at that and you say, oh, those are pretty reasonable numbers. You know, we spent $750 per participant. That's a pretty good amount of money. That's not in the thousands of dollars per person. So then you might say, okay, I think we want to dig a little deeper into this. We might want to do an impact study. We might want to try to find a control group in the data and be able to see whether or not this program we've implemented is having the impacts we want it to have. So these could all be a progression. And this really does circle back to the idea of, how often do you do evaluations and when? And the concept about these can be multi-year, these can go on over time. So this really is about an underlying approach to use evaluation to apply to the work that you're doing, to learn more about the impact you're having, and to ultimately make improvements in what you're doing. Now, the next slide, we're getting near the end, folks, hang with me. The next slide talks more about funding. So I just want to pause one more moment to see if there are any other questions about evaluation options.
Yes, we do have some. Who is responsible for conducting or executing the evaluation component?
So that's up to you. That's one answer. Basically, as you saw in the requirement at the very beginning, the most clear and specific mandate in the law is to Title I programs. Ultimately, the state is going to be held accountable, and you're going to tell that story in your annual report about what's happening. Now, who does that study is in a lot of ways up to you. We're going to talk about that more at the second webinar. But let me just say, it could be a third party. It could be, you might have heard of things like the Upjohn Institute, or you might be working with one of the great universities in your state to partner on that. So you might be funding them to do a study, but it might not be done by your staff at all. In some cases, you might have evaluation staff within your agency or one of your partners. So sometimes, like in Washington State, within the LMI shop, there was a research and evaluation team. And those were folks who had backgrounds in statistics, econometrics, and they were able to do studies in-house. So there's no mandate about where it has to happen. Ultimately, it needs to happen, and you as a state, working with your local boards, your state board, figure out what makes the most sense and is the most practical for us to be able to do that.
Okay, and then we have, do environmental variables such as higher barriers or COVID-19 play a role in analyzing evaluations?
Yes, with an exclamation point. So we have learned some things from the Great Recession, I think, that can be applicable to what's going on now with the pandemic. So anytime you have outside influences, and they're always outside influences, right? They're just not always as population-wide as what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic. But you want to make sure you take that into account. So one way to make sure you do that is if you're doing, let's say, an impact analysis, and you're looking at a particular time period, you say, okay, we can assume that this was going on from, let's say, the second quarter of calendar year 2020, so April, May, June. We know everybody was impacted by the pandemic. That's probably pretty safe to do, to say, we can rule out that impact because everyone was impacted by that situation. What you would want to avoid is to say, I want to compare pre-results for that second quarter of calendar year 2020 to people second quarter calendar year 2021. Well, that you might have some problems, because if you're trying to say, has our program improved or people doing better, that's going to be hard to pull away from the impacts that the pandemic had during that first quarter. So yes, those things are very important, and you want to think about them, account for them, and in your studies, and you want to try to avoid having those skew results. On the flip side, though, you also can be an opportunity for you to see what impact the pandemic had. So there could be times when you intentionally want to look pre, during, post the pandemic to see what that did to folks across a broader cut of the population. So there are a couple ways that that can work for or against you.
Okay, and then we have, and you might have already touched on this, Cynthia, but we had an attendee ask, has Illinois made any decisions as to what type of evaluation it's planning?
So I've worked some with the Illinois team. I don't want to speak too much for the Illinois team. But the process the team went through that was involved in the evaluation peer learning cohort was really looking at how do we build up capacity and funding around evaluation. And so that was less about here's a particular evaluation we're going to do tomorrow. We're going to start tomorrow, and this is what this one would look like. So part of what I wanted to help represent is the kind of menu of options that are available to you. And it's going to depend upon program by program. So you want to make sure you have an evaluation plan and kind of map for your state that you can report on in your annual report. Say, here's overall what we're looking at. That doesn't mean, or in fact, that probably should mean, that you would include in that, by the way, we had an implementation study of that out of school youth program we were talking about earlier. So we had an implementation of study of that because that was new and we weren't going to do a heavy duty impact study. We just wanted to make sure we were implementing the program we thought we were implementing. And then over here in Title I, we had a dislocated, well, that was also Title I, my apologies. And also in Title I, the dislocated worker program, we had a program we've been working on for quite a while. That's the one related to commercial driver's license. And we wanted to make sure that the way we were providing services was having a unique impact on the population. So for that one, we're doing an impact analysis and we're needing to come up with a control group that'll give us some really sound results. So all of those things could be a part of what your plan is, and depending upon what you're studying and when, that will really drive kind of what approach you take. And we are going to talk more about that at the next webinar about what are your research questions and how does that drive what kind of methodology you choose.
Okay, and then the last one that we have two more.
Okay.
Does the state lead the evaluation and the locals participate, or do the locals do their own?
So this is another one where you got options. The requirement here at the federal level is to coordinate and to consult with one another. So that I think is important in a few ways. One, you don't want to all be doing the same work. So you don't want a local area paying to fund a study that's very similar to a study that's being conducted at the state level. You also want to make sure that with scarce resources, that priorities are aligned, right? So if there's something a local area would really want to look at and analyze, is that also a priority at the state level? And can you partner in that so that it's more cost effective to do the study, and you might even have a few local areas look at it as well. The other idea too is, and this comes back to the comparable situation with federal studies that are going on, you don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper. So you can say, what are other local areas looking at? What has the state level looked at? How can I get some ideas as to where to start? Are there some dead ends I don't want to pursue? So the feds expect you to cooperate and coordinate. Ultimately, I advise that because that's going to allow you to maximize your resources, to have complementary results to each other, not overlapping. Because what you don't want to do is come to the end of the year and go, oh, look, we did 4 different studies all on virtually the exact same thing. That might not have been the best use of our funds. So those are a couple thoughts about that, but bottom line, there is the expectation at the federal level that you be coordinated across state and local levels.
Okay, and then we have a couple more. Do you want to address these?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there statistical models to account for such variables? I think
Well,
this.
yeah, I'm not sure what variables you'd be talking about, but there's a statistical model to adjust for absolutely any variable you can imagine. So anything you want to pull out or adjust for, there's fancy math you can draw on to do that. The only limitations can be is, especially if you need some sort of a control group and those folks don't exist, or they do exist but you don't have the data on them, those can be limitations. But in terms of statistics and a variable, you can come up with any fancy old formula you can imagine.
Okay, and then we have, it looks like a comment. Thinking of the data collection needed from our clients, I was thinking that it would be nice to have the form information that is to be filled out highlighted to make it easier for us and the client so that there are no missing parts.
That's, first of all, thank you for bringing this issue up. So that's a great comment and a great observation. If you don't have simple, easy data collection, none of this is going to matter. So if clients aren't sure when you ask them about their current employment, if you really mean, are you employed right now or your last job you had, your data is not going to be great. And if they're not filling in all of the key elements on your form, you mentioned highlighting to make sure you draw attention. If folks aren't answering the question, and let's say you only have half the population who responded on race ethnicity, then you don't necessarily know if you can draw conclusions or not because you have too much missing data. So anything you can do to simplify the process, first of all, it's going to mean fewer headaches for your case managers and your customers if the data collection is simple, but it's also going to mean much cleaner, better data that's going to allow you to come out with some really meaningful results. So absolutely do things like that, and thank you for bringing up that aspect.
Okay, and then how do we know what practical steps to take if we don't know if the state is coordinating something or if our individual agency needs to do so? Or is it by the local area and not every agency?
So I would refer you to the team who has gone through the evaluation peer learning cohort, and Mark Burgess is the team lead on that. And we can give you some more specific information on who to contact at the next webinar, or maybe even as follow-up to this webinar. But that would be the first thing I would recommend, is to get in touch with the folks who are on that team. They have really good representation across titles. So you're probably going to have someone, and I know there was a representative from a local area. She was great. So you would want to start there because they've been taking the time to figure out what is the what level are we at in a cross evaluation in the state in terms of where our strengths, where our weaknesses, and what sorts of things do we want to look at moving forward. So that's really where you would want to start. So I will commit to make sure we get you that information, if not as follow-up to this, then as part of the next webinar.
Okay, that's all we have for now.
Okay. So the last major topic is about funding. So, okay, here are all these great things. Now, how on earth do we pay for it? Well, here are some options. You know, they're not all going to be great options because it's not as though there's a new money tree for this. So having worked many years at the state level, I know what that looks like. And especially the smaller local levels, that's even more dire, right? So what may you do? You can use funds from any of your WIOA Title 1, 2, 3, or 4 core programs to conduct evaluations. So that's all allowable. You can use or combine funds consistent with federal and state law, regulation, and guidance from other public or private sources to conduct evaluations relating to activities under those 4 titles core programs, including those funded by labor and other federal agencies. So this basically says we want you to do it, we encourage it, please fund it. Don't forget the governor's set aside, the state set aside. That's something where you can be looking at using funds from that to do evaluation. This is also an area where I mentioned a little bit before, you might want to be partnering with universities. Sometimes you'll be able to find a common mission where something you want to have evaluated to help you inform your practice could also be something that a PhD student really wants to look at as well. So looking at partnerships and opportunities, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next webinar, but where can you find pockets of money to be able to do this? Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this has to do with this kind of, this being an ongoing way of life and looking a little farther out into the future, you're going to be starting to think about, or you're already well into thinking about, what this next program year looks like. So starting with July 1, what are your plans for those monies July 1 through June 30? Most of them might already be allocated and planned out. Okay, is there wiggle room? You want to start looking at those annual budgets to see where there are pieces you can look at. Also, when you're doing RFPs, if you're having an outside third party implement a new program, you're contracting for that program, think about including an evaluation requirement in there to basically say, here's what we're going to pay you to do this program, and you need to do an evaluation as part of that. I recommend being as explicit as possible about what type of evaluation and what that looks like, so you really get what you're intending to get out of it. But those are some of the things you can think about in terms of funding. Definitely allowable cost under WIOA. Like I said, that doesn't mean there are all of a sudden tons and tons more WIOA dollars. So how can you partner? How can you see opportunities with your universities, with others who might want to be looking at things, who might have a mission that aligns with yours? With that, these are some resources for you. This is the stuff we've talked about, much of the stuff we've talked about today, the law, the regulations, and also too the technical assistance evaluation toolkit, evaluation readiness assessment, evaluation design assessment. So those are some of the things we've talked about today that you're welcome to take a look at. In particular, the evaluation toolkit, if you take a look at that, that'll help you if you're able to join us for the second webinar, where we're going to dig more into what conducting an evaluation looks like. If you've had a chance to glance at that, it's a really long document. It's got great stuff in it. Please just skim it and look for particular areas that seem really interesting to you. Don't try to read the whole thing cover to cover, because I don't want to totally lose you. With that, any other questions about anything we've talked about today? You guys have already provided great questions, and I really appreciate that. Then I know it's not just me talking out here through my laptop.
We do have a couple. What percentage of funds across all titles would they be the same?
Would they be? Oh, so yeah, that's a judgment call, and that's a question I've heard folks ask the feds. What's a benchmark of what percentage I should be using to spend on evaluations? It depends. I know this isn't a helpful answer, but the answer is it depends. And it's going to depend upon, so let's say 1 year you really want to focus on an evaluation around adult basic education program. Well, then it might be a fair expectation to say that, you know, in that year we might have more funding input from Title II. Or you might say, you know what, we're going to be cycling through evaluations, but we really want to pool money. So we want to take X percent from each of the titles, and that goes into an evaluation pot. And we all equally pay for what evaluations are happening that year. So there are any number of approaches you can take. Also think about the fact of, in some cases, let's say you have someone at the Title I dislocated worker program who has quite a bit of background in statistics and evaluation. So they might not necessarily be able to pony up money, but say, you know what, we can be a resource to all the other titles and partners because we have expertise that you don't have to go procure from outside. So we're going to make available 10, 20% of this FTE, which is our kind of in-kind contribution. So there are different ways you can look at it, but there's no set expectation or perfect answer. The feds are not going to say it has to be this percent or that percent. But those are some of the things you can think about in looking at how to do that.
Okay, and then Cynthia, I did have a couple requests to share your email with everyone in case anyone needs questions or contact you later. Is that something you're comfortable with?
How about that?
Perfect.
Absolutely. No, happy to share my contact information.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, but webinar 2 on this topic is going to be on May 6th, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I love it. I love having slides that are ready to go. So yes, so we're going to skip next week because next Wednesday I think there's another topic. I'm sure it's incredibly fascinating, but I'm biased and it's, you know, it's not me. So I'm not as excited about it as I am about the ones on the 6th and the 13th. But so, yeah, what we're going to be talking about on Wednesday the 6th is planning and performing evaluation. And this is where we get into some more of the nitty gritty about figuring out what's the question you're trying to answer and what methods might you use. And then on the 13th, we're going to talk about reporting out evaluation results. So how do you communicate results? How do you help inform practice with those results? Which in a way I think becomes the trickier and more interesting part of this whole process, which is making those evaluation results meaningful and actionable. And then I'll go back. And you can download these slides. They're here in the webinar. So I know I've been flipping through them, but you can download them, and that also will give you my contact information. You don't have to just write it down while it's on the screen.
Yes, and then you can also download them via our website, which is icsps.illinoisstate.edu. And you can also find the webinar recorded there as well for future reference, and that'll be up in the next couple days.
Perfect, thank you. You guys are slick. You've got all this worked out. I love it.
We did have another question.
Great.
Is there a prior evaluation performed one can review?
Prior evaluation performed. So at the next session, we will talk about some examples, and I will make sure we have some examples and some links in there to examples. So I don't have them as part of this slide deck, but I promise to have that as part of the next one.
Okay. Any more questions? You can go ahead and type those in the chat box and we'll answer those. I don't have any more coming through, Cynthia.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we can wrap things up then. Thank you, everyone who joined. And for some of you who joined and it wasn't quite what you were expecting, I hope you got something interesting out of it anyway. I would encourage all of you to come back for the next session to learn more about the nitty-gritty of evaluations. Because even if you're not going to be conducting evaluations, you might be providing data for them. You might be using the results to apply to your work. So I encourage everybody to be a part of sessions 2 and 3 as well. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time and attention.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, attendees, for attending today's webinar. As stated earlier, you will receive a survey asking you about today's webinar, and please share with us your experience and any suggestions you might have to improve these webinars. You can also register for the next webinar in this series on our website or through the WIOA newsletter. So if you are wondering about that, please go ahead and register for that next webinar in this series on May 6th. All right, everyone have a great day and thank you so much. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Bye.